Hello and welcome to FireDEV, a fireside chat with people in the industry. Today, my guest is Lenni Olinsson. How are you doing, Lenny?
I'm doing well. Thank you for asking.
Fantastic. So, you work at Paradox Interactive as a art director. Do you want to tell us and the audience a little bit about what Paradox is, if they don't know, and what an art director is, and and what they do at Paradox?
Yeah, of course. So Paradox Interactive mostly works with grand strategy games such as Stellaris, Crusader Kings, Victoria, and similar games. They also have a broader portfolio of games that they're handling through publishing. But yeah, in general, they mostly focus on the strategy games and strategy genre. As an art director there, especially since the current title I'm working on is Crusader Kings III, I'm sort of a custodian of the project, meaning I maintain the current artistic vision of the game and support the art directors to make sure that new projects are visually, how can you put it, uh, visually adding to the gameplay experience, immersing the gamers more into the game and the game mechanics as they play. And of course, then adding new elements into the game as we also add new mechanics to make sure that we keep the overall feeling for the players. So usually what I do as an art director is when we work on new DLCs is that I will work in a bit advance of the team, and I will start looking at the game direction document and define, like the key pillars. What is it that we're looking at here? What are the major components visually that I want to reinforce and how they should look like? So sketching things out a bit, talking to the designers, ensuring that what we are going to be making visually fits with the overall gameplay. And then once that has sort of been broken down to a general, was like high, um, like general pillars of the art direction for the new DLC, then I will then communicate with the art team. Usually the leads and specific people will join in early in the concepting phase. And then we'll sort of further explore on those initial pillars, those initial designs, together also with designs as well.
Okay. And at Paradox, Paradox has made, loads of games over the years. What specific titles have you worked on and are working on?
What specific, sorry?
Titles or specific games.
Currently, I'm working specifically, and also when I started at Paradox, I worked on Crusader Kings III from beginning until now. So over the past 2.5 years now.
Okay. And for a game like Crusader Kings, how many art directors would you typically have on a project like that?
Well, we only have the one. We have one per project.
Okay.
So I mean, currently for Crusader Kings 3, when I joined on, they had already started development on the DLC Royal Court.
Hmm.
So that one I continued on and took it until fruition. And further than that, we've then been working on the FireDEV Iberia expansion and the Tours and Tournaments, which just released a few months ago as well. And then, of course, more DLCs going on in the background, of course, in development.
Okay, then. So because Crusader Kings was already, underway in terms of development, and you was, working on some DLC when you joined,
Hmm.
did the pre? I mean, I'm guessing it's safe to say there was a previous art director, and they
Yes,
moved to a
exactly.
different project, or they left, or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. I think the previous art director when I joined was the current art director for Victoria 3.
Yeah.
So I basically took over from him because, of course, working on two projects simultaneously is a bit much. So I took that over for him. He already had a very nice vision laid out for the Royal Court that I then continued working on and then polishing and adding more features to, of course. But I mean, the general layout was already there, and I saw no reason to sort of shake things up partway through production.
Okay, so you just basically jumped right in to
Hmm.
where he left off. Okay, and as as an art director, how important is it to look at obviously past games because it's not the first one in the
Hmm.
series, and also other games as well, from the competition, for example, see what the state of the industry is like, or is that left to someone else and that's fed into you?
No, no, that's of course important for all director roles, but also for the team in general, right? To try to see what the competitors are doing. Is there anything that, that we could use in our current game that fits with the style that we and the gameplay that we are currently using? And we also look at like if we're making new games in the future, what is currently happening in the sphere of strategy games, grand strategy games. From competitive side, is there something that seems to be is there something that the fans want, something that they're lacking, something that we might be able to put into a future expansion or future game, to sort of capitalize on that need from the fan side, right? But yeah, we try to keep a track of things that's happening in industry as much as possible. Of course, this is more relevant when you're starting a new game than when you have an ongoing project. Not to say that it isn't relevant in an ongoing project, but usually when you start out anew, then you really try to look at what is currently existing in the market, what might come in the future as well, and try to see like what niche do you fit into? What is your core fan base? What is the expectation for this type of game? And try to see how you can set yourself aside from the competition, of course. But similar things does happen while you're in production of DLCs, of course, but to a lesser extent usually.
Okay, that's that's definitely interesting. So what sort of prior experience does one have when trying to become an art director, and obviously specifically what prior experience did you have as well? Because you
Hmm.
joined in 2021, and before that you were at some other companies as well.
Yeah, exactly. So in the past, for a lot of art directors, they came from a 2D background. So illustration, concept art fits quite well when you're trying to concept a new game title or ideas for a DLC work quite well. There has been a bit of a change over the recent years that is going more towards people with a 3D background who might also be able to do 2D or vice versa. So it's more of a demand on technical expertise for art directors than there were in the past, more like part of the general development cycle as well. So my background comes from originally I was a concept artist and illustrator, and then started learning 3D art through a vocational education in that was the game assembly in Malmö, and then worked my way up as an environment artist through different companies, such as I worked at IO on the Hitman project and Forza Horizon at Playground Games and Avalanche as well, and King as well in in the past, trying out mobile games as well. So I worked from of course, intern junior environment artist, and worked up to lead, and then later on when I joined Paradox as an art director.
Okay. And you mentioned that, like an art director would typically come from like a 2D, artist background. Why is that? Because, when you look at Crusader Kings, it's not 2D. I mean, it's not like your normal type of 3D, like Call of Duty, for example,
Mm.
but it's what do we call it? What, 2.5D or 3D with a certain, vantage point? It's definitely not 2D.
Yeah, exactly. It's more of like an isometric perspective.
Yeah.
Um, So it's still 3D. Of course, the world does exist and it is in 3D. We do work a lot more with menus, so UX and UI is exceptionally important in this game. We also work a lot with illustration, so illustrators are really important. We use them for event images to provide flavor for events that happens. Um, and of course, like 2D artists, one of the reasons why they have in the past at least been very much preferred, still is in some projects, of course, as art directors, is because what we're doing is that we're setting the art direction, we're setting the style, and being able to sketch that out, concept it out, is obviously faster than doing things in pure 3D, depending on, of course, the type of games you're doing. Today, with Megascans and other similar tools, you can do it a little faster. But historically, it has been faster to like test out ideas, test out looks and styles through a concept art background. That makes perfect sense. And then when you go more in towards the production, then the art director is more there to review on specific areas, like is the props that have been made, are they fitting the general feel that has been sketched out before? Is the scenes in alignment with the ones that have been sketched in art direction and similar? That's also like even today when you're having art directors who have a 3D background, either character or environment or similar, there's still a preference towards art directors who are able to, at least to some extent, sketch out ideas. Because when you provide feedback, verbal feedback sometimes can be very difficult to give for specific art assets or environments are similar. So explaining to someone that something feels off is a very sort of like famous quote. When you like the worst feedback you can give an artist is that something feels off, right? That's not helpful, and the artist will then stare themselves blind in image trying to find potential flaws where there might not be any. So being able to provide paint overs, sketch out, like it feels a bit off. I think um, removing some of the details on this side of the image will lean the composition a bit better. Apply some more colors here to help lead the eye for the player so they know what route they're supposed to take. Things like that. Just being able to sketch it out is like a huge help in providing feedback because you don't really want to go in and actually do the artist's work for them. Like if I go in and start editing in compositions, in scenes directly, sort of like provide a final sketch of what I want, that both take away from the artist's work and their feeling of ownership, and also takes away from their motivation. So that's something that I strive not to do. The art director should not really be doing much of the final art that is in game. They might be able to help with benchmark assets early on in production to help set, like this is the general look and feel like you have in the style guides. So depending on the background the art director has, they can then set benchmarks for how things should look. But once production hits the grounds, you shouldn't really go in. At least in my belief, you shouldn't go in and start editing the artist's work directly.
Okay. And as an art director and just like in the art, industry in general, previous to Paradox you worked at King,
Mhm.
both those companies make a lot of games. They make, very top tier games in their respective sort of industries and, formats, but they're very different in terms of, the way they look, the art
Hmm.
style. Obviously King, her focus is heavily on like 2D, and Paradox is, they have a lot of 3D games. How do you know bring your experience that you have from previous roles and previous projects to the next one without it being derivative, and also feeling like, okay, you can tell that person worked on, I don't know if you worked on Candy Crush at King, but you can just tell he's worked on Candy Crush, for example. They're like bringing those mechanics or that sort of design over. How do you prevent yourself from bringing it over, and but bringing your core skills?
Hmm. Well, I think for one, it's quite rare to have someone who comes from a previous experience into a new company as an art director who only has experience from one studio. It's of course possible, but it then tends to be a studio who has done more than one game, and they would have worked on more than one game. Most sort of job postings for art directors tend to require that you've worked on several games to avoid that exact issue. So of course, I've worked in at King, not on Candy Crush specifically in the past, but other projects. And I think the experience I bring with me from there is things such as UX, like um, how can we guide the player as well as possible through menus. We do have a lot of those in Crusader Kings as well, where we can sort of like look at, how can we improve the feeling of like using these menus. And I think a lot of the experience I then had from working at King and working with mobile games, where it's super important that the players has like an intuitive grasp on what buttons does what, and the kind of feedback you get while playing the game is something that I would then try to implement here, not in the form of like you get stars and like explosions of color, more in form of getting like tactile feedback for the player, right? It feels good to make this decision in game. I see when something is supposed to be interacted with. New elements added in, new decisions to take. It's something that the player gets informed of through the UI. It's something that I've been trying to implement more here. So that can be some of the experience I've taken with me from King in the past, and then other experience from other companies and games that I worked on in the past, of course. But nothing from any one, of course.
Of course. So, Crusader Kings, it's the third one in the series. Had you played the previous ones or not?
No, I actually haven't played Crusader Kings 2 before. So when I joined first, of course, even before I joined, I sat down and started playing Crusader Kings 3 because I hadn't actually played it before. I was aware of the game. I had watched playthroughs before, but I hadn't really played the game before. So one, usually through like how much I work in the games industry, I don't spend that much of my free times actually playing game. I usually watch playthroughs to get an idea of as many games as possible and to spend my time more efficiently. So of course, when I started a company, I then tried to play the games as much as possible to get a better understanding from like a player perspective of what are the things that the game does really well, what is the sort of fantasy, what is the immersive aspect of the games, what do I feel it might not do so well, and while doing that, of course, also like read reviews on Reddit, YouTube, try to get an idea of, like what is the fan base, what is it that they are super hyped about, what is it that they dislike about the current game. Also read on what are the comparisons to similar or previous titles of this game. So in this case, we had Crusader Kings 2 before, which is great because then I can sort of extrapolate some data about what the fans enjoyed about that title more than enjoy on perhaps the newer one or things that they would want to have implemented in the Crusader Kings 3 version.
Okay, I want to dive into one thing that you said about playing games, or that you don't play as many games as you probably used to because you're in the industry, you've got games, and everything to do with games around you, for like 8 hours a day, possibly more, and
Hmm.
your gaming is reduced because I've heard that from a lot of people before, not just in the gaming industry. Let's say if they're a programmer, for example, when I spoke to them about do you do any programming projects for yourself, especially because when they're younger, they would like at university, but do you do it now? And I get a very similar answer from many people that they're exposed to so much of it at work. They want to disconnect. They would want to either feel fresh when they come out, whatever it is, they don't do it as much. How do you feel about that? Because gaming is usually a pleasurable activity. It's
Hmm.
something that I think a lot of people have fond memories of, and that can create fond memories when you go into adulthood. And a lot of people, if they have a non-gaming job, they might come home, if they can spare the time, they might play some games to be able to wind down. So how does that make you feel that you are consciously making a choice to game less?
Hmm. It's not so much a conscious choice, it's more of a separation. So normally, like when I play games, and I still do, of course, from time to time, I'll play with friends and then specifically try to avoid games that I might spend a lot of time into. So it's mostly just focused on just, actually sitting down, talking with friends while playing the games. And then it tends to
Okay.
be games that are more, you know, what can I say, like not so involved, like, simple action games, or, more of a play and let go kind of games, like hyper casual games in a way, right? So just talk with friends while playing, try not to focus too much on the details because that's a very normal problem to fall into when you're working in industries. Whenever you're playing a game, you're at the same time in the back of my mind, especially for me, it's like in the back of my mind, I'm like looking at things in the game. So wondering how did they make this? Is this tiling textures they're using here? Is this a modular asset? What method did they use over here? It's like, oh, I see they purposefully are trying to make me go down this route instead of this one. I wonder why they chose to do it this way. So I'm like, there's a constant commentary in the back of my head and reviewing the games that I play, which just doesn't make it as pleasurable as it did in the past. So I try to pick games which are quite different to the ones that I'm work on deliberately, and then play them with friends to try to get my mind out of that kind of thinking. And then usually, because of course I need to experience as many games as possible to keep up to date with the industry, then I'll normally watch playthroughs. That I can also do during my work time. So I have several screens set up. So I have one with like YouTube playthroughs on similar games or just new games that are popular to see, like what are they doing? Because even if they aren't specifically strategy games or grand strategy games, there can still be things to be learned from, like how they are doing their characters, how they're doing the environments, the UI, especially. There can be a lot of things to learn from other games there, even then if they aren't in the same genre. Um, Other than that, I just enjoy going on places like ArtStation, Behance, and things like that to just like get a new perspective of like new techniques, new fads in the art industry, that might be something we can implement in the future, just something to get new perspective, new eyes, to look at things.
Okay, and so you're just talking about, you try and play games that aren't so involved. You mentioned hyper casual, which is usually associated with mobile games, but you also said playing with friends as well. Like, can you give some examples of the sort of games that you would and do gravitate towards to
Hmm.
fill that, and the games that you stay away from, the type of games, and with some examples because they'll be so involved and the amount of hours and also the concentration level would be too intense for what you're looking for.
Yeah, I think usually I gravitate more towards like action games, PC mostly. I don't really play that much mobile games, but usually I play PC games. Currently, I'm playing a title that one of my friends worked on in the past. So we're playing as a Dead Island. So we're just going through that game, and it's easy to just have fun and talk while we're playing that. It doesn't really require too much, like thinking while you're playing. It's just action. If we die, it's fun. We laugh about it. You start over and you go again. So these type of games that are just like easy to just talk while you play is the ones I enjoy the most. Otherwise, it's like many great games like Elden Ring and games like that that might be a bit more involved, more hectic. Is probably something I would try to gravitate away from. But of course, watch on playthroughs to sort of get a good experience of the game. But something that I know I would sink a lot of hours into because I really enjoy that type of games.
Okay. And whilst you was a king, you was a lead environment, artist.
Hmm.
What does that specifically involve, and how is that different to an art director? Plus, what games did you work on at King?
So at King, I worked in the new games unit. So the games I worked on has not been released, and so of course I can't say specific. But I worked on games that were used more 3D elements in there. So my job there as a lead environment artist is a bit similar to art director, but specifically focused on the environment. And I don't really do the front loading art direction. There is an art director for that. So what I did as a lead is that I would then work with the art director to sort of understand what the art director wanted, what kind of style we were going for, what the general look for new levels would be, and then ensure that the team followed that as much as possible, right? So as an art director, you are in charge of several disciplines at the same time, so you cannot really be down nitty gritty on what everyone is doing every day. As an art director, you rely on the leads to sort of go in and do that and be more aware of what people are doing and giving more moment to moment feedback. And then as an art director, you then step in on sort of like weekly reviews or similar, depending on what you want and what type of director you are, of course. But then try to give a bit more to the team to sort of like handle and then step back and try handle things ahead of time, I would say.
Okay. So you mentioned that the project that you worked on at King, you were there from October 2020 to June 2021. So you left a couple of years ago. It
Hmm.
still isn't out. So it's been in development for 3 years, maybe more. Like, is that typical for a, King game? Because when, when I look at a King game, let's say like Candy Crush, though it's a big complex game, I don't, think it would take 3+ years to make.
Hmm.
Is that just more unique to this title, or is it because they're larger now and there's more at stake with each project and launch that they're spending more time? What's the situation with that?
Well, of course, I can't go too much in depth with the
Of course.
project specifically, but what the new games unit mostly do is that they will explore new concepts, right? So they will work on mockups, they'll try things out, they'll do maybe some user research, and then if it doesn't do well, they will then jump onto something else. So that does not mean that the project is even currently ongoing. It might or might not be, or if it is still ongoing, it will likely have changed its form in some way to match. Um, uh, the user research that they have returned. Maybe they didn't do well in specific areas that they wanted it to do well and have then make adjustments since then, which of course could make the development take longer, or they would have decided to do something completely different because it did not hit the market in a way that they would want.
Okay. You mentioned that, you're a PC gamer, so, PC Master Race. And that's, what you gravitate towards. And, that's what Paradox, heavily specializes in. But King, as we probably all know, Candy Crush, for example, and some of the other games
Hmm.
are, mobile based. So, did you, like, how did you sort of adjust to that, and did you like play more mobile games as a result?
Oh yeah,
And like,
definitely.
was that ever a thing that, okay, you're not enough of a mobile gamer?
No, no, exactly. When I joined, I had of course played Candy Crush before in some mobile games, but I wasn't like an avid mobile game player.
Hmm.
So when I joined there and saw the new game that they've been working on, I quite enjoyed it. It was a very interesting game, like a bit different from what they had been working on in the past. And I would basically play that like every day for at least half an hour to just like test out, the changes that we've made, the levels, help debug as well. That's something I quite enjoyed with mobile games. It's a bit easier to just pick up and put down, especially when it comes to testing. Whereas in PC games, if you're testing something, it's generally a bit more involved. It takes a lot of time. And whenever there's something that goes wrong, it can be a myriad of reasons why something went wrong. There's so many variables involved here, um, that it can be quite hard to debug the exact reason why you had a soft crash or a hard crash, or even why certain things did not play out the way you expected them to. So that was definitely something that was quite enjoyable about working in mobile, is that the iteration was really quick. When you had an idea or when you saw a potential issue, the time to test out ways of fixing it, alleviating the issue, or playing alternatively or trying alternative playstyles was really, really quick. So you could go from having pretty much like a blank canvas to having a testable demo in just a few weeks, at least with the talent that was on the team when I was there.
Okay. And has your time at King, changed the way access and look at gaming? Because like you said, heavy PC gamer. Has your time at King made you a bit more of a mobile gamer, or was it just like you obviously played it a bit more whilst you was at that role, but then afterwards you just went back to your normal PC gaming?
I would say I now permanently have Candy Crush on my phone. So I do play it from time to time whenever I'm either flying or waiting in airport or similar, where I don't really have access to that many other means of what can I say, like playing games. So it's definitely something that I then gravitate to when I have like some downtime there. But I wouldn't say I play much more than I did before. But yeah,
Okay.
I think it definitely influenced some ways that I viewed mobile games. Whereas in the past, I didn't play too much. I tried once in a while, but never really got like hooked on mobile games. Now I sort of see it in a different way after having worked on it, especially knowing a bit more about how you sort of work with usability, especially in the UI, like how important that is and how you can guide players to certain behaviors while they're playing the mobile game to engage in mechanics that then make them feel better about playing the game. Like you would keep testing things out. Like, does this feel rewarding to the player? Does it not? And it's very few things you have to actually put together to change the entire reward aspects and have players feel better about playing the game. And then trying to balance that with the difficulty, like how often is it okay to fail before you then actually lose motivation and stop playing the game? And how often do you need to fail to stay motivated to be extra happy when you win? And this sort of mentality and then playing around that was something I hadn't really done that much before, because typically with PC games the time to start until you lose tend to be a lot longer, so there's more forgiveness if the play experience might not be perfect, right? Because it takes significantly longer for you to lose usually in a PC game. Well, we have seen PC games that have started incorporating more of these elements recently, or I don't know how recent. There's been games like this in the past as well, like such as Fall Guys and other games that are like hyper casual but on PC, that has similar sort of mechanic that try to make sure that people are enjoying it as much as possible, even if they are losing very quickly.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, it's been a while since I played Fall Guys. I used to play it on PlayStation, but yeah, it definitely gives you that feeling. It's because you're not waiting too long to get back into it, for example,
Hmm.
and it's just quick, easy, and it's the mechanics. It's one of those games that it's easy to get into, easy to learn the controls and the way it works, but there's a little this is element of difficulty to master it, especially let's say to be in the top five every single time past the line. So there's definitely an element of challenge there as well. So yeah, games like Fall Guys have definitely bridged the gap. Have you ever thought about platforms like the Nintendo Switch or something like the Steam Deck, which is more like a PC but in like kind of a console but handheld format?
Well, I believe you can currently play Crusader Kings 3 on the Steam Deck. I do have a Steam Deck as well, to test to test games out and how they are to play on that console as well. But I haven't really been using it that much in the past. It's just been enjoyable to test out games, see how is it actually playing on the Steam Deck, how is it something that I would enjoy using more. But currently, I think it's mostly just decoration on the living room table.
Okay, I mean that's interesting. Like you're saying there, you're testing, Crusader Kings and games in general on the Steam Deck. Because I remember when they announced the Steam Deck, one of the things they was adamant about, and I think they stuck to it, is that they won't have Steam Deck specific titles. Obviously, they have like Steam Deck verified, and they have like different tiers, like how well it runs on your Steam Deck. But how much of a focus is a platform like this, Steam Deck, and now ROG Ally as well, and some of these other portable, gaming PCs effectively in the testing process, because it is I look at it and I think it is one of those things that could be the de facto way of playing games in 10 years possibly, the way Nintendo was the king at one point, had like over 90% market share, but right now PlayStation and Xbox are the two big platforms on console. How things have changed, and I see that potentially happening with something like the Steam Deck and some of these other platforms, that this could totally shift. So how much of it is a focus for companies like Paradox to make sure that their games work well on it?
Steam Deck hasn't really been that much of a focus for Paradox, in general. I think so. I would say for Steam Deck, it's similar to the issue you might have with mobile games. It's like, of course, the game shouldn't be made specifically for Steam Deck. That's at least what Steam is saying. But some games would play better on Steam Deck than others. For instance, Crusader Kings 3 has a lot of text on it. They have events that will pop up that require you to read. Having a smaller screen would, of course, be an issue in this case, right? So while you can play it and you can definitely enjoy it, it is not made specifically for Steam Deck and might not be as enjoyable as it would be either on console or on PC. And of course, that goes for other games as well. Like some might play very well on Steam Deck due to the graphics and the kind of experience that you're supposed to have, might go well on a small screen as well as a larger one. Other games would probably be the opposite, right? They would not play that well, or the experience would not be that good on Steam Deck, simply because one, they haven't optimized for it. Two, it might not be an experience that's meant to be had on a smaller screen.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. A portable form factor is one of those things where certain games really lend themselves towards it. It's like mobile. As you mentioned, that some games just work really well on it. A game like Candy Crush, a game like Clash of Clans, for example. Those games work fantastic, and I
Hmm.
don't think they would do nearly as well, I can guarantee it, if their primary focus was PlayStation, Xbox, PC even. Obviously, I think with PC with the mouse, maybe a bit more, because remember, you used to have games like Solitaire and like chess used to be a big focus for companies, but it wouldn't be the same as it is on mobile. But then you see the thing where a company will release, let's say maybe it's an older game, but they'll release a port on mobile, like Grand Theft Auto, Max
Hmm.
Payne, something like that, Knights of the Old Republic. Yes, they'll do well because they've got a fan base and they'll immediately get those sales and those downloads. But when you play it, you just feel like it's not the same experience. It is significantly better having it on some sort of, whether it's a PC, whether it's a console with controller, or maybe even like the Nintendo Switch or Steam Deck, where you've got a smaller screen but not too small, and you do have a proper controller as well. So yeah, the Steam Deck for those sort of games that you said, with a lot of text, where it is really ideal to be able to be close to the screen like on a PC, but have a reasonably sized screen. Certain games just won't work as well. But that's interesting to hear that you do test it, but it's not like a huge focus. And I think maybe on certain of the titles, ones that lend themselves towards that form factor, it possibly, could be more of a focus, during testing.
Yeah, I think I worked on, like I said earlier, like Forza Horizon in the past. I think that would probably lend itself quite well to Steam Deck,
Yeah.
just due to the gameplay style, right? You don't actually need the tiny details to be visible. You have like most players unfocus when they're playing things like a racing game. So you essentially see the road, big obstacles, and your car, right? And then you have like the larger UI elements that tells you your speeds, any potential issues, how well you're doing if you're in a lap or something like that. And that's kind of the main things that needs to be visible. And they are usually visible regardless of if it's a big or a small screen.
Oh yeah, and something like Forza, not only can he work well on a platform like the Steam Deck, a portable form factor like that, I think he lends itself really well to it because
Hmm.
obviously on that smaller screen, yes, the hardware isn't as powerful as something like a PS5, for example, and obviously as tuned or like a gaming PC, but because it's a smaller screen, lower resolution, you can still squeeze a lot out of the game. Still looks good, and it lends itself well towards like a controller, which is effectively why it's attached to a Steam Deck or a ROG Ally, and that just feels like you're playing it on Xbox or some racing game on PlayStation.
Hmm. Yeah, I definitely
So
agree.
I noticed that on your LinkedIn, every single role that you've had says on site, next to it.
Hmm.
Are the sort of roles that you've had, including art director currently, do they lend themselves more towards being on site versus remote, or are you more of an an in office person?
Um, hmm. I think especially given my role, it's like being in office is needed to be like on site with the team, being able to act on potential issues that are getting brought up, be more personable also for the team members to actually see that you are a person, that you do exist in real life, and that they can approach you with issues or any concerns. So I do feel like that is quite important. I do currently work at Paradox. I have a rule of like, I think it's 3 days in office, 2 days that we can work from office or from home, whatever we like. So we have a bit of like a hybrid model. And I do, of course, then take some days where I work from home simply because it's easier, especially if I have a meeting heavy day. To work from home means that I can sit by the laptop and that is my meeting room. Whereas if I'm in the office, usually I would have to jump around to different meeting rooms, often booked right after each other, right? Which basically means that you would have to be able to teleport between floors to be able to make it. So on those days, I definitely prefer working from home. But
Okay.
yeah, in general, I do feel like it's important to have to have a rapport with the team, to actually be in person, um, especially if you have leadership or management roles. It just
Okay.
works better. But then it's of course depends on how well the team performs. Off sites, there's definitely ways you can make that work. It just it needs to be worked on a bit more to see how you can improve communication, make sure that everyone is aware of what everyone's doing, and make sure that people have a easy way of reaching out to each other throughout the workday if you are working primarily remote. Not saying that that it's not possible to do.
Okay, so you spoke about days that are heavy, meetings, heavily based around meetings. You prefer doing remote because the offices are at different parts of the building, different floors, etc. So many times they're booked right after each other, and unless you can teleport or just, unless you're like Superman, you can just go through the floor. You're struggling with time. Like, is that not something that the company you know actively thinks about? Because obviously I'm assuming not everyone is remote on that day, and if you're potentially running a few minutes late to a meeting purely because you have to be able to get to the next meeting, like, is that not something that you would think the company or you guys that are organizing it would try and solve in terms of scheduling, plus allowing for, let's say, a bathroom break between meetings?
Yeah, and that's definitely something that I advocate for and also try to do is to like make, of course, a buffer between if I put a meeting, then I'll try to make sure that there's like 5 to 10 minutes after another meeting. Because, but of course, not everyone is aware. Some meetings get put throughout the week and they don't check whether you have something before or after. And then there's only so many meeting rooms, but a lot more meetings happening throughout the day, right? So even though we do on the floor that I'm working have several meeting rooms, we do not, especially on more hectic days, we do not have enough meeting rooms to cover everyone's requirements. Meaning then meeting rooms or meetings get split out on meeting rooms on different floors because you need one, and it might not actually be that you can have one on the current floor that you are at. So then you might have to take a meeting room that's available on the sixth floor while I'm working on the second floor, and that adds extra time to get between them. Uh, But I mean, that's just something about to try to set up meeting cultures, meeting room culture, and things like that. But that ends up being the old joke of having a meeting about meetings, right?
Yeah, I mean, you've obviously got to get that balance of, you know, refining the process, but not making it so the process of refining the process becomes the majority of your, your job. Because if you're building a house, you got to lay bricks. You've got to, set things up. You got to, lay the foundations, but you've also got to plan it as well. But if you're spending all your time planning it, making sure you've got the right amount of bricks, making sure everything's okay, everyone's okay, the weather's right, everything. But 2 months pass and you don't lay a single brick. It gets to a point where you think, okay, we're wasting time. So yeah, there's definitely that, and I think anyone has that sort of issue because some people are of the mentality of let's just go, 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 and they don't want to sharpen the sword, they don't want to sharpen their axe before they chop down the next tree. But then there's some people that go the opposite way and they want to over plan. They want to try and over prepare, but then they're like just in meeting after meeting after meeting, and it's sort of that rise of that middle management, BS sort of roles where you're not actually doing anything and you're not producing anything. If anything, you're providing negative value to the company.
Yeah, you're basically referencing that book. What's it called? Bullshit Jobs, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I mean, of course, some of this is sort of like that comes from like the past in doing COVID, of course, right? Where everyone was working from home, so it required more meetings. And then as everyone has gone back to office, a large part of that meeting culture persisted for a quite a long period, where you still, for some reason, felt the need to have meetings, despite most people being in the office. But also now, because we have more of a hybrid culture, a lot of places we see like some people by like necessity or simply because it's easier for them work from home on some days, which require you to pretty much always have a meeting room no matter what, because some people might be working from home, and in order for them to join in on a meeting they need to have a specific meeting to be able to join, so a meeting room is then required. So that means that you need a meeting room every time you want to have a small meeting, something that could have been taken, at the coffee machine, simply because not everyone is in the office. So that's a bit of an issue with this sort of hybrid model where not everyone is in the office every day. Um, but otherwise, I think we have managed to cut down quite a bit on the amount of meetings we have now. Like found out, which ones are necessary, which ones aren't, and also now that we have started planning a bit further ahead, that then requires fewer sort of impromptu meetings to handle questions that should have been answered months in advance.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely an interesting point that you raise, is that when you do have some people in the office, some people are at home. If there's two people in the office, one at home, and it involves all three people, you do need a specific meeting place. Sometimes, where you would maybe just go over to the desk, lean over their shoulder, and maybe grab someone else, that's 10 meters away, and say, what about this? What about this? Points at the screen. 2 minutes later, you've resolved it, and
Mm.
or you figured it out. You've got your next course of action, and you go and execute it. But if, let's say, there's more than just you two in that room, the last thing you really want to do is whack open Zoom, it be on loudspeaker, and you're talking to someone at home. You're disturbing other people, or potentially they're disturbing you, because if they're trying to communicate amongst themselves. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely a problem I would foresee at any sort of company that has a hybrid model. And I think another interesting point you made, that during COVID the necessity for more meetings was required, but then obviously because people get so used to that sort of meeting culture, because it kind of makes you feel like you've done something, that you've achieved something, because you've got other people there, they've attended, you've attended, you spend time, and you've come out of it. But you got to think, was that meeting there because you specifically needed a meeting, or was it there just due to the way people happen to be geographically speaking?
Yeah, and a lot of times you also end up taking time from people who might not have needed to be there, but have been added to the meeting just in case,
Hmm.
right? So while the meeting might have only required 3 people, because there is potentially more stakeholders, depending on which direction the meeting will go, you then invite 8 people to a meeting that should have been free, right? I will say on the benefit side of things, though, is that this kind of meeting culture that has been happening in the past and has, of course, veered more into the present as well, has then also made for a like better documentation, right? So like now, usually the meeting culture, at least your Paradox, at least for the team that I'm working with, we have like a when you set up a meeting, you have to write in the description what is the meeting about, what is the like the expected result, what is it that we should hope to have achieved by the end of the meeting. Usually we'll also add meeting notes. We're using Google Meets. Then we have meeting notes where people usually someone is sort of like a secretary for the meeting, writing down what has happened, what the decisions are, and who made these decisions. Right, there's always written in the top who is in this meeting. Right, so that leaves a paper trail of all decisions. Whereas in the past, you might ask, like, or you see something is being worked on, you asking like, why are you working on this? And it's like, oh, this was a decision that was made a couple of weeks ago. It's like, oh, but by who? And sometimes you just get like a shrug emoji in answer, right? And no one really knows. And when they say like, oh, it was this person, and that person says, oh, but that's not what I meant, I think you're referring to something else. It becomes a bit difficult to figure out what was the original intent and why things happen this way. But now when we have a bit of like a more structured meeting culture, with specific rules set for what is considered a proper reason for a meeting and what is considered a proper result of a meeting, then there's an easier way of finding out, like where what happened and sort of like why.
No, yeah, for sure. It's definitely a problem when you don't have enough context, enough information, and obviously, people either ask a lot of questions, and then somebody might get annoyed, and then that makes the person just fill in the blanks, and then they start working on something for 2 weeks, and it turns out that's not what they meant at all.
Mm.
And then obviously, because there's no actual documented, documentation of what occurred, what conversation occurred, the other person just denies it. Either they deny it because they don't want to be blamed, or they might just not remember them. It might have just been an offhanded comment, and in a previous meeting or just in general, and as a result the person has gone off and started spending time 2 weeks doing something. So yeah,
Yes.
that's obviously definitely a problem. Like, how do you handle yeah, and try and prevent people from just doing meeting after meeting after meeting and not actually doing any work? Because one, obviously that can accidentally occur, just because they think we need more meetings. But it could also occur if somebody really doesn't want to do work, but they just want to jump into meetings because it's work. But if their general work is more creative, let's say programming, drawing, or like an artist, for example, they might find it easier just to be in a meeting where they're talking about it, but nothing's ever getting done. But they can say, I was in a meeting for an hour, I was in a meeting for 2 hours. You can't expect me to be, writing lines of code whilst I'm in a meeting. So,
Mm.
like, how do you try and prevent that and try and get the optimal number of meetings?
Well, the ones who are supposed to be in a meeting, technically, usually the leads and the managers are the ones where you can't really avoid it. That is at least part of their function. Like same with directors as well, of course, right? So that's like a large part of the job. But for the people who like the actual the developers, the ones actually working on the game, is like those we try to limit the sort of meetings, right? So usually whenever they're in a meeting, it tends to be bigger meetings, right? Like presenting, like the goals for the next DLC, like working depending on, of course, discipline, having like a workshops or having weekly reviews. So we try to set up structures for like this is the forum where you ask questions, these are the people who are supposed to be involved, and then usually we can like invite people who might be part of it, but they're set as optional in the calendar, right? So like they're not required, but can join if they feel like they want to have a bit more of an idea of how things are going on, but then they can join from their computer and just work while listening to things in the background. So try to structure it in a way that's more like regular meetings, but not, like impromptu. Hey, I think we should have a talk about, like this menu screen, or hey, I have a really cool idea for this new character outfit that we can do. It's like those we try to keep for specific days, where we go through and review the work that's been done and look into, like what are the future tasks, what is the priorities, are we on time, are we not? Is kind of like normal meetings that you have, right?
Okay.
Otherwise, like for leads, directors, and managers, it's like yeah, a large part of their week will be meetings, but that's mostly because a big part of it is planning for the future and also talking with other disciplines outside of the immediate development team, right? Like with marketing, with production, of course, and with the audio teams, it can be a lot of different things that aren't like part of the core team specifically, but still needs to be involved. And that's usually the managers, leads, directors who is the contact point between the different disciplines.
Okay. And as somebody who sounds like that you do your fair share of meetings, what sort of project management software, calendar software, and just general tools do you use as a part of that for organizing it, for making it as efficient as possible in your day to day job?
Yeah, like usually at most places I work, use Google Meets. Quite easy to see what's going on. You can see others whenever you try to book them. You can see their calendar, whether they've set themselves as like just busy in general, or if you can actually see, like what is it they're talking about. I usually try to leave my calendar as transparent as possible so people can see what it is that I'm doing. And if they then feel like, hey, I see that you have this meeting, I have something that I have some input for this that I would like to bring up. Then either they can bring it up to me, or I can then invite them for the meeting if I feel like it would be better for them to be that person. Um, so that's usually how I structure the meetings and make sure that everyone's sort of aware of what's going on. Otherwise, there's different tools for different companies, right? Like have something like Asana, have Confluence, like for documentation, pipelines, stuff like that. So it's quite a few different tools, and it depends on the company what they feel is the best for their needs.
Yeah. So on your LinkedIn, there's a lot of information about, the companies you've worked at previously, your job roles. But when you go to the education section, it's quite minimal. It
Hmm.
says from 2013 to 2014, you was at somewhere called Game Art, and I think you rolled from what it was Game Assembly or something. Can you, expand on what that is and, your education, prior to coming into the gaming industry?
Yeah, sure. So the Game Assembly is a higher vocational school in Malmö, Sweden. I do believe that they have more places where the education is now offered. But that's basically where I went, like directly from high school. Um, so I've always in the past enjoyed art and was trying to find a place where I would actually be able to turn that into a profession that I could live off. And sort of combining that with my love of games back when I was younger was just like the perfect opportunity. So we didn't really. I'm from Denmark originally. We didn't really have educations for that in Denmark. But I was looking for educations in Sweden, and I saw that they had game assembly. So I had some experience basically teaching myself 3ds Max in the past, and then I applied to the game assembly with a portfolio of assets that I had made and managed to enter the education. And then through there, I then learned more about how to make games. They basically have a course where the education is basically that you are working with in teams throughout the years and making several different game projects. Back when I started, you start out with like the earliest version of games that existed, kind of like just the was this sort of like adventure games, like where you just like write like text-based adventure games and then move on
Yes.
from there to newer types of games, like moving throughout the game history from the beginning. And while the programming team sort of like learned to create more and more complex engines, for the artists, it was more about learning, like how to create more and more complex art assets and how things are working, right? So going from 2D illustration background to like sprite-based assets, and then into full 3D assets, but like simple models, and then into more complex third-person and first-person games. And along with that, there's also then, of course, individual projects on, like where you're supposed to make assets, like make a mech or a robot, make a character, like do some concept arts, and pretty much getting you through like the full spectrum of what a very like a 3D generalist in a way, right? Learning from concept art to character art, hard surface modeling, animation, VFX, and environment art.
Okay. And one of the questions I get a lot, from people that want to get into the gaming industry or tech in general is, I don't have a degree, or my degree's in something totally unrelated. How do I get into the industry? Did you ever have any pushback from, because the companies you've worked at have not been small studios where there's only like three of you. They've been big, studios. You've worked on, major AAA projects. Have you ever had pushback where they say, you don't have a degree, you don't have the conventional, education, or education background? Obviously, the latter companies. Once you've worked at a few companies, you've been in the industry for many years. It's less of an issue. But at the start of your career, did you ever have resistance?
Not at all. I mean, part of this education is basically offering an internship for people to, try out work in a company and for the company to try out the intern, right? So I think that's kind of what was vital here. But I've never had, like, no, you don't have a bachelor or master or what have you, right? There's been no sort of requirement for that, at least not in Europe, where I've been mainly working. I cannot really speak for all companies around the world, but at least not in Europe, I've never heard that even happening.
Okay.
Especially for artists, and I think also to programmers and probably also designers. I don't know too much there, but there's usually a test that you have to complete. Like for artists, there's an art test, like do an asset, do an environment, do something to show your skill beyond what, at least if your portfolio don't sort of like show 100% match, right? Like if your portfolio shows that you're good at doing, like general props, but you're not, like you haven't shown a proficiency for environment art of the type that the company would require, and that's the position that you have applied for, then usually the company would then require you to do an art test to sort of show the required proficiency. Similar for programmers as well, there's also a programming test where they would sort of like ask you to complete a task that shows that you would do well with given task in the company. And that's usually the focus. Like most companies prefer to have, like the required skill more than the required sort of knowledge. If if I'm explaining it correctly here, right? They prefer people to actually know and have knowledge, like have actual experience doing things specifically, more than they want them to have a specific background in education.
Yeah, I know what you mean. They'll rather, that you have used Photoshop, and that you have experience in the tool itself, uh, rather than sitting in a lecture or and listening to someone talk about art and talking about Photoshop, for example, or whatever the tool might be. Obviously, if you have both, that's like great. But
Hmm.
yeah, totally. If you have the experience, and then if you can demonstrate it on your CV or your portfolio somehow, that you have previous projects, previous work, previous companies, that's what will definitely get you the job. And because that's the advice I give to anyone, because obviously if they want to go down the typical university route, there's nothing wrong with that. Go for it, but it's not the only route to go down. If you are willing to put the work into it, you can save potentially a lot of time and definitely a lot of money by self-educating.
Yeah, actually, to that point as well, I would add, of course, this is very much depending on the university, but from a lot of people that I know, especially within art that has a university background, many of them had to actually go out and do a vocational education specifically to art after university, simply because the training in university is like classically, a lot of times it's specific to I can say like it's not practice knowledge, it's more of a theory, which does not really do well, especially when a portfolio or specific expertise is required. So a lot of people that I've seen in the past who came out of university do not have the practical knowledge to be able to enter a company, which has been like sort of like a bit damning for that part of education, at least here uh, in Scandinavia, specifically in wider Europe as well. I cannot speak specifically to, of course, U.S. education or others, but that's something that I've seen a lot. Is like the theoretical knowledge won't really get you very far, and you can actually completely do away with an education to a big part. Like vocational school offer the internship route, which makes it a lot easier to get a foot in the door, but there is the possibility that if you, for instance, have already practiced on your own, I would suggest then, like reach out to people on ArtStation that you see, like people who are active in the industry usually go for people who are like a bit more, can we say, junior experience, people who've been in the industry, like 5 years or similar. Of course, some seniors might also be more active than others, but people who have not been in the industry for too long tends to be a bit more active on ArtStation. So like reach out to them, ask people there if they would mind, like providing feedback for your portfolio, like what kind of assets would be good to have if you want to get into, for instance, their company. And then you can sort of try to get mentorship through them, right? And that way you won't really need an internship as much. It would still definitely help if you went through the vocational school and got the internship. But I think if you actually reach out to people and get mentorship, especially if that's the company that you wishes to enter, then you can sort of show professionally, show your learning and get, like a recommendation for people who actually work in the company. So that's definitely one route of doing it, and it definitely will not hurt your chances. So, like, always a good route to take.
Okay. So, extending on what you already said, what, specific advice would you give to, let's say, an 18-year-old that, wants to get into the gaming industry, has a passion for art, they've been drawing since they was a child, they're good, they want to become an artist within the industry and eventually become some sort of art director like yourself. What advice, tips and tricks, and also things to avoid would you say?
Hmm. Well, like I said earlier, from the educational point of view, it's like I definitely, maybe I'm a bit biased here, but like I would lean more towards the shorter education that vocational schools offers due to the internship route. And also they tend to have a higher degree of like entering the job market, since that's specifically, those educations are specifically for that purpose. Other than that, of course, like I mentioned earlier, reach out to people on our station who will be able to mentor you if you can, and you are able to, get a hold of someone who works in the company, like the dream studio that you would love to work at. Definitely try that. That would help you a lot and teach you a lot about the company before you even join. So that would be a huge benefit for you. When it comes to like once you've joined the industry, of course, then like you start out as either an intern or a junior, and then you will have to learn a lot fairly quickly. And of course, that can be a very stressful period. I see a lot of juniors who essentially have like almost like imposter syndrome, that they don't believe that they're as talented as they need to be there, because it's quite rare the company's taking a lot of juniors at the same time. Most people have a tendency to compare themselves to whoever is nearby. And if you are in a place where all the people around you are at minimum experienced and more often than not senior, it can be quite a stressful period and challenging. So I definitely like give us a shout out to the juniors and interns. That is a very normal feeling to have, and that is something that's, it takes time to get over. And do not compare yourself to the seniors. Like people who have, like 5-10 years of experience are not the same as someone who's just started.
Yeah,
Of
one hundred
course,
percent.
So of course, what you're going to be doing when you first start, you're going to be learning the actual pipeline, the workflow. It's quite different from company to company, especially due to most companies working with their own proprietary engine. So like an in-house engine, which is not the same as Unreal or Unity. So if you come in with the expectation of it will be like working in Unreal Engine 4, you're probably going to come in for a bit of a surprise. Um, Different companies have engines that are more similar to Unreal than others, but most of them will have, some things that you might perceive as lacking compared to workflow that you have gotten accustomed to working with Unity, Unreal, Godot, similar. So that's definitely going to be a bit of a learning curve. And not all companies are as good as others at keeping things documented. Usually they'll use something like Confluence or Asana or similar for documentation, but it can be outdated or have not really gotten updated to reflect the current state of the engine. So expect to ask a lot of questions. You will probably at some point be annoying your seniors, but that's just how it is. And if they don't want to be annoyed, they can just document things. So probably not say that if they're already annoyed, but you know what I mean here.
Imagine saying that to your senior. You're only getting annoyed because I'm asking you questions, and I'm only asking you questions because you didn't document your work, so it's your fault.
Exactly. While it is true for sure, probably not the best to say in a tense moment already, right?
Yeah, or in any moment, in general, especially to someone that's more senior to you and potentially has the power of, getting rid of you potentially or giving you, a bad, bad feedback.
I mean, it sort of
You know,
depends. I mean, but that's sort of like a good segue in a way, right? Because depending on where you're working as well, like in Europe and Scandinavia especially, we have very much what we call like a flat hierarchy. Does not mean that a hierarchy does not exist, but it means that we are quite open for people, like speaking their minds. Like a junior can easily tell me about they think like something that I have planned out for the future is wrong due to this and this reason. And it's not like I'm gonna throw a fit and say like leave. Uh, that just doesn't happen, right? And being open to critique, regardless for where it comes from, is just a better approach in general, right? Especially like juniors tend to come into the industry with like a fresh perspective and knowledge of new tools, which a lot of seniors and like higher ups might have become like a bit of like jaded, don't have the time to test out new things as much as possible, or don't have the same sort of inner fire, you can say, to keep updated with all of the newest tools at all times, right? So listening to people regardless of like what their background is or what like stage they are in their career is just good practice. So I would definitely say that depending on of course where you work, I don't know if like how what kind of hierarchy is in all companies, but generally in Scandinavia most of Europe will have a fairly flat hierarchy that allows everyone the opportunity to voice their thoughts, regardless of whether or not this is a positive or negative thing.
oh yeah, for sure. It's definitely something very interesting and something to think about. So that's all the questions that I've got more specifically related to your job and your experiences. At the end of all my podcasts, I have a rapid fire fun generic questions. Are you ready for them?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. If you're running a company, would you rather run a 10-person or a 1,000-person company, and why?
I'll probably run 10-person companies simply because it's easier to set up structure, right? So I think any company starting out, if you start out a company tomorrow, you would have to start out with a core team anyway. No one usually starts out with 1,000 people. That just wouldn't be a very effective way of doing things. Like start out with a core team, identify, like what is the pillars of the company, what is the goal, what is the projects that you want to work with, what is the company culture supposed to be, and then hire people for those specific purposes, right? If you start with 1,000 people, it's going to be very difficult to set any of that because the culture is created by the people. And if you have 1,000 people, then those 1,000 people will create the company culture, regardless if that is a like a happy, productive place or if that's a toxic workplace, and you will no longer have any power over it. But if you hire based on what it is that you hope your company should be, then you will be able to control what it will become as well.
Okay. And would you rather have €5 million upfront or $500,000 a year for the rest of your life, and why?
I mean, 500,000 for the rest of the year. Just, basic math seems like that would do better.
Okay. And what's your favorite board game, video game, and movie?
Ooh. Board game, I would say backgammon. Video game, probably Prince of Persia. Movie,
Which Prince of Persia?
uh, first one, I would say.
Sands of Time, I think that's the
Yeah,
first one.
yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, the first one would probably be the one,
That's how it's scrolling one, the
yeah,
old one.
side-scrolling one, but that's not the one I'm referring to. I'm referring to Sands of Time.
Yeah.
Movie, I think one of my favorites would probably be A Knight's Tale.
Which movie? A Knight's Tale, did you say?
Yeah,
A
with
Knight's Tale.
Heath Ledger. It's quite a good one.
Okay. I don't think I've heard of that one or seen it. What's that one about?
It's basically what can I say, like it's a medieval setting of a knight's tale, a young squire who is basically faking. He takes over after his knight dies without anyone knowing, and then he takes over his identity and then tries to rise in the ranks while hiding who he actually is. It's a very, interesting story. It has a lot of sort of medieval setting that I enjoy, and at the same time, it has a amazing soundtrack going with the story.
Okay. I mean, now that you described it, I haven't seen it, but I think I've seen clips of some sort of medieval movie with Heath Ledger, in there online on YouTube. So,
Hmm.
I mean, I'll definitely check that one out. So, what video game are you looking forward to? Because obviously you're in the gaming industry, you're a gamer yourself. What game are you looking forward to?
I think uh, Black Myth, I think it was called, right? Sun Wukong, the one that's coming out from China. I think it's called Black Myth. Let me see.
Okay, and what is that game for? The audience.
I mean, it's a third-person action adventure type of games from the looks of it, and it just like mostly for me, it's just pure graphics. Looks absolutely amazing. The VFX, the animation, everything looks like it's just like scale up to 1,000. So I'm looking forward to see if they can actually, like deliver on what that has been shown so far. If they can, it would be amazing. Um, but yeah, we'll see. A lot of games when they're shown, like the early versions of it tends to look amazing, shown at E3 and stuff. And then when it gets released, they had to, actually optimize it for consumption, and it tends to downscale the graphics a bit.
Yeah, that's definitely a problem that plagues the gaming industry. They'll show something off, sometimes not even on the actual hardware, some beefed up hardware, or you'll just be a little segment where they can get it to run just for that little bit. But when you actually get hold of the game, it's nothing like it.
Hmm.
So, what's your favorite, games in terms of like a artistic standpoint and also a graphical standpoint?
Hmm. Yeah, like a artistic and graphical standpoint. I think I really enjoyed when I first saw that. It was like Limbo.
Yes, great game.
Sounds I sound completely biased because it's a Danish studio, but I really enjoyed that. I think it was an amazing use of graphics. Like do more with less was
Yeah,
basically what they showed, which I think was a really good way of doing it. And it kind of goes to that old saying, like a a product's never perfect until there's nothing left to take away. And I think that they kind of followed that mentality quite well, whether by intention or not. Other than that, you of course have games such as Journey, which was stunning in its visual storytelling, which I think is still like something to really raise up when it comes to games. That they did again, they did a lot with a little, um, really showing the journey through the game and how that sort of like the lighting and the environment really gave you an idea of where you were in the game and what how well things were going and how the story were progressing.
oh yeah, those two games are definitely amazing games. Have you played Inside from the developers of Limbo?
Yeah, yeah, I definitely have as well. I didn't feel quite as attached to that one visually as I did with Limbo. Inside it still looks good. It plays well. It's a good story. But I don't really feel like they nailed the art style as perfectly as they did with Limbo. I think it's also a very difficult one to follow up on. Like they just hit it so spot on with Limbo, and Inside, while it was a great game and a good story, I think there was sort of like a disconnect a bit between the art style and the story in that case.
Yeah, I know what you mean, Lenny. With Limbo, it definitely did encapsulate that philosophy that you was talking about, where they simplified it so much. It was at a point where they had very little they could take away from it, and I think you get projects, you get games, movies, books, whatever it is, like the sequel or the spiritual successor to it. You feel that like the developers and the community feel like the ante needs to be upped, and you see that with Lord of the Rings, the game. I mean, the movies. Obviously, I know they're based on books, but there's a similar principle. You look in the first one, Fellowship of the Ring. At the end, the battle is very small scale, very good, but still very small scale. The Two Towers. You're going into what I think probably tens of thousands of Urukais, and not tens of thousands of good guys, but still a lot of good guys as well. Again, you're upping the ante even more in the Return of the King. I think you're looking at hundreds of thousands of orcs, and there's also those major battles happening in different places. So it's they're up in the ante. Lord of the Rings is definitely an example where it worked, but I feel like with Inside and Limbo, they kept the same sort of style, gameplay wise, perspective wise, but they added more complexity to the visual art style, kind of maybe to flex or try and push themselves technically speaking, because in terms of just what was going on, that it definitely was better from the perspective of there's more going on. Not that that necessarily made a better game, but they definitely did more visually. But again, that issue, what you were saying, that doesn't necessarily mean it's better.
Yeah, but I think as well at the same time, it's maybe a bit unfair to compare Limbo and Inside because they're not really they're not a, it's not a Inside is not a successor to Limbo. So while I think again here as sort of like a fan of the title, someone who's played it, there are certain expectations, and you always end up a bit comparing titles from the same studio, even though they are not successors of each other, similar to what Lord of the Rings is. Like in that case, having a comparison side by side is sort of like fair because it is the same title that is continuing. Um, Whereas Inside is like a brand new game, and they tried something new. They veered a bit more away from this sort of unknown horror to more of maybe a bit more of the uncanny to some extent. But I just don't feel like, for me at least, that it did as much. Like it did, the art style didn't really give me as much of a sense of the story as Limbo did. I think Limbo was just so well done that it's so difficult to follow up on it, right? I think the only way I could really compare a similar game, I guess a bit to both Limbo and Inside, would be Little Nightmares, which is far more, like graphic. They've gone into far more effort to make the graphic look beautiful in that game. But here they're also playing less to the unknown and more into the uncanny horror, right? Like the things that that just behave differently to what they should. And I think for Little Nightmares, that really worked with them showing more and having more of a moody lighting that sort of like was a bit of like the vehicle for the story in some sense, right?
Yeah, 100%. I know what you mean. It is definitely a comparison that get made and easily to get made because they're from the same studio. It was the next game as well. It was done in a. It's not like they went from doing a racing game to an FPS game where you can be like, yeah, it's not the same. The comparison doesn't seem logical. So there's some logic to the comparison, but you're right because it is not a sequel, unlike the Lord of the Rings, movies or books. It's a hard one. But I agree. I didn't feel the same sort of emotion that I felt when I played Limbo compared to playing, Inside. And I feel like there were times, even though I overall enjoyed the experience and I want to play the game again, I feel like there were times I was pushing through it more so because I had played Limbo, I liked what they did with it, and yeah, it was kind of similar compared to with Limbo. I was like, I want to see how this pans out.
Mm.
I want to see the ending.
Yeah. Yeah, but I feel like on one hand, of course, it must sucks a bit that, like that you keep getting your new title, your new darling compared to your previous when you go like this has nothing to do with each other, right? It might be a spiritual successor in that it is the same sort of game style, but the overall story, the art is like completely different. But on the other hand, it's like it's very sort of like it's a good bad situation to be in, right? Your first game was such a smash hit success that it's going to be you're always going to be having unfavorable comparisons to that, but it still made the studio what it is today to some extent, right? For I think it's called Playdead Studios. So I mean, yeah, while it sucks getting comparisons to a previous title that it's a shadow that it might be difficult to step out of. It still, like allowed the studio to continue on for as long as it had, and of course give new titles more spotlight than it might have otherwise gotten. So I mean, it's a good situation to be in, regardless.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, but it's definitely a great situation to be in. I wonder how much of, how much pressure there is once you do something like Limbo. It does really well for the type of game it is. It's critically acclaimed. If you speak to probably anyone that's actually played it, they love the game. When you're making your next game, to, kind of think, do I want to do something totally different? Or do I kind of want to play it safe? Because I think that's definitely another difficult position to be in. Because if you say, I'm not going to do Limbo 2, maybe that might come out later on, but right now I'm not doing Limbo 2. I'm not even going to do a game that feels similar like Inside. I'm going to go to something totally different, because it's kind of an easy sell to,
Mm,
to be able to say, I made a game, we've made a game. It's the similarities, or you don't even need to say. People will fill in the blanks for you. Like the media will sell it for you because made by the Limbo developers, very
mm.
similar, but the big graphics. Like, if it's to say stuff like that, people will just be like, "Ooh, I want to get that." Whereas if they just suddenly say, "Oh, the Limbo developers are making a football game," people might be like, so I think some people will be intrigued, but I think a lot of people will be like, "Oh, I'd rather just stick with FIFA."
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be from fans, regardless of like if you go into like a completely new genre of a game. There's always going to be an expectation, right? If you're, Limbo is like even if you do like a third person, shooter or action adventure type of game, it's probably going to have like some dark mystique to it. Similar to for like other companies, if they were doing a new game, you would similar to like the question that you asked me in the beginning, right? Like if I had worked at like let's say only King for my entire career and then go over to Paradox, would it become distinctly obvious that this is a person who has priorly only worked at like Candy Crush or something else, right? You would probably see that very visibly. The same with studios, like if their primary knowledge and like the games that they worked on is like all these kind of dark, mysterious games, even if they go to a completely different title, you would at least to some extent expect to have some of those elements come through. So I don't think you can ever really step away from what sort of like put your studio name on the map, nor should you really want to some extent, right? If you, as a studio, if you've grown big enough and you want to do that, then normally what a lot of studios do is that they diversify, right? They start branching out. So same studios, like Paradox have a lot of subsidiaries, and same as like like I worked at Avalanche in the past, they also have now subsidiary studios who are part of the main company, but because the subsidiaries have different names, such as Systemic Reactions from Avalanche, or here when I'm working like Paradox Studios Black, then there's like a way to separate the games from each other, like from the bigger sort of like identity that the company has created. So that's usually what would happen when a company grows big enough to want to, like diversify, try completely new genres. Then they kind of tend to then also branch the company out, so have like, new names attached to it.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's definitely a good way to go when you're at that size and you do want to do something totally different. But I think some people might fear that, okay, there's a lot of respect and sort of attention on this particular brand and name. If I do something totally different
Mm.
and I don't really attach much of a name of my current the current brand to it, is it going to be successful? Am I going to have to start from scratch? Because it's and I think it's logical. You've worked hard. You've worked hard to create that brand. That recognition, that community. Do you really want to almost do that again for another title, or do you want to just kind of bring that community over to your next title, via the easy route?
Yeah, and you can see that in Paradox, right? They've like, doubled down. They just like we hyper specialized on the grand strategy games in a way, right? We do have, like other studios that we publish for, that then works on other titles. And of course, there's also some new game development happening in the background as well. But the overall like identity of Paradox is the grand strategy games, and that's what they're working on, right? So then they do new versions of that, like set in different historical periods, set in space, like Stellaris, but also like following the same, like ambition, the same like uh, they're not mechanically the same, all of them, but they follow the same thread, you can say, right? And I think that's one way. That's definitely one way of going about it. Like this is something that you're doing really well. This is a niche market you to some extent have cornered, right? So that you have a fan base that know what to expect from you, know what you will deliver, even if you do a totally new or a new setting for the game. They know sort of like what the mechanics will be. That they know how to play the game, especially like longtime fans of Paradox games. And new users will also be able to like they play one Paris game, and they are then more likely to also like play other games because now they have understood the mechanics, and a lot of this will carry over to another title. So they're able to jump within the entire catalog of games and get new experiences that has some similar mechanics that allows them easier, like starting off points.
Oh yeah, for sure. So, my final question is a two-parter. Does money buy you happiness, and what does a good life mean to you?
No, I would not say that money buys you happiness. I mean, it buys you, we can say, like in a it's a more relaxed situation in a way, right? Like you do not have any concerns in the back of your mind, but if you're in an unhappy period of your life, having more money will likely not improve on that. So yeah, no, I would not say money buys you happiness. It just buys relief in a way, right?
Okay. And, what does a good life mean to you then?
Well, a good life is, basically finding what you do enjoy to do, like in your downtime. Like when you're away from work, whatever you do enjoy doing. It's like for me, I really enjoy reading. I enjoy, like sitting, working on pet projects. Of course, being out with friends and things like that. Those are fairly like simple things, right? They're not things that require a ton of money, like I said earlier. So, I mean, finding the things that you do enjoy in your everyday life and then, giving yourself the time and opportunity to pursue more of that. I think that's what is a happy life, right?
I mean, I find that very interesting, but I do like it because a lot of people, when I ask I ask like literally everyone, these rapid fire questions.
Hmm.
The answer I usually get of what does a good life mean to you is primarily usually either family or career. Like those are the two things. But the fact that you said finding something that you enjoy and that I guess gives you sense of happiness or value outside of work,
Hmm.
and making it so is it fair to say that you're saying that work can be fun and enjoyable, but it's a means to an end, and the end should be what you enjoy outside of work, hobbies, you say you're like hanging out with friends, reading, is that basically what you're getting at?
Yeah, so what I mean is basically for work, for friends, for family, like from any sort of like outside influences that can, of course, both make you happier, make you enjoy life more, make you enjoy your everyday more. Those are still sort of outside influences. the happiness that you will gain from that can both go up and down, right? Of course, hopefully every day when you go to work, you're happy, you're fulfilled, you're motivated. That is rarely always the case, right? So for me, finding something that recharges my battery, something that I just enjoy doing moment to moment, doing my downtime, like between work, just like in the weekend in some periods, like that to me is very meaningful. Like that's what allows me to sort of have an equilibrium in a way, right? Of course, I definitely enjoy, like spending time with my family. Given that they're in another country, it's not as often I can meet them as I would want to. And of course, I spend, like a lot of time with my partner. We go out enjoying, like on the weekends, go out, like eat, shop, just enjoy each other's present, and like talk and have fun. Um, and same with like friends as well, right? But that's, you still need, to me at least, I need to sort of have the sort of equilibrium moment where I just like sit down, do something that I enjoy in the moment. For me, that's a lot of times I enjoy reading, just like sit down, read. It relaxes my mind, allows me to just decompress from, like might be stressful at work, or other things that are just like need to sort of get out of my mind and then do something else for a period of time. And once I've done that for some time, then I have room and energy to do other things that might require said energy. So for me, I sort of like try to find the happiness in the small moments between other things. Not saying that other moments are not happy, of course, but just like the equilibrium that I need.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an interesting response and something that I don't really get on the podcast, but I do, like that response because we're too caught up in our, careers a lot of the times, and you made a really good point about your career might be going well now in terms of you enjoying it or growing, for example, but there'll be times where it's not going the way you want it to. It isn't. It is maybe an upsetting time, whether it's truly an upsetting time or you're upset and but it's not really that much wrong with it, whatever it is. But there, you will go in ups and downs in your career. So yeah, I like that you're saying if you focus solely on getting the happiness from your career, you probably will be disappointed, but then finding something to you know find interesting, get your teeth sunk into outside of work, obviously getting, relationships, friends, family, whether that's gaming, you said reading, what sort of books, do you read, for fun and for enjoyment?
It's a bit mixed, right? It's like I both enjoy things that are more kind of like things that are like practical books. I really enjoy reading about psychology, about history. Otherwise, like when I'm just relaxing, then I treat books like movies. So I'll read, like novels, like a lot of fantasy novels and things like that that I enjoy reading. Um, so for me, that's sort of like almost like movies. Like I just read a movie, so to say, and then I can read it at my own, like speed. Or what if I want to go back and read something like, oh, this is really interesting. Sometimes I get at ideas for like mechanics in games. It's like, oh, this is like a really cool thing that might, like be useful to some games. Or I can see like how something like this might be implemented, right? So I still have things that could relate back to what I do in my work life. Um, and like especially reading about psychology and things like that is also something that I can like use when I'm talking with friends and family. Like maybe people are going through a difficult time, so perhaps I'm able to help people talk through their problems or what they're facing at the moment, like be a better friend, be a better partner, be there for my family in some cases. So there's still something I gain through, like in my personal life, in my connection with my job and friends and family, but something that I find more, like relaxing to do on a day-to-day basis. Like what you said with job earlier as well, like your career will always have, like peaks and troughs that you can't really control, right? Like some years you might get a promotion, you might get a huge salary bump. Other years the company's not doing so well. You might not have performed as well as you felt you had, or like have that set to you doing your review. Like your employees, like might yeah, your team, there might be people who are like leaving, people who have like personal issues that makes it very difficult for them to work, and of course you try to help them talk through their issues. I mean, we just had here at Paradox some studios that we closed, which like I work personally with the people there, so of course that's also a very difficult situation, more so for them, obviously, but of course very difficult. Like you're talking with people who are going through a crisis in their life, right? And that's not something that's beyond your control, like unless you own the studio, and even then, you're not fully in control. It depends on how well your studio is doing overall. So I mean, those things are always going to impact you. So I find it really important to have something that just lets you settle in the moment, right? Lets things slide off you a bit. Uh, Focus on something else, gather some energy, like don't think too much about what you've been doing during the day, like things that are stressing you out. Just let it slide off, almost like meditating a bit in a way, right? At least that's how I treat it.
Well, fair enough, and I think that's definitely a good way, to approach it. So, before we wrap up, what's your, favorite two books that are more, non-fiction, whether that's biographies or, psychology, history, more the, let's say, the educational books,
Hmm.
type of thing, and then the, two favorite, novels, fictional side of thing.
Hmm. I think it was Light and Color. I think it's one of the books that I really enjoy, like reading. That's like specific, for or imaginative realism as well. It's like thing from this the same author. It's like really good when it comes to like improving your composition, your lighting, your like the colors that you're using in a scene. It's like great books, regardless of whether you're working in the game industry, movies, concept art, illustrations, amazing. Um, I think was like it was Philip Zimbardo's. I think it was the Lucifer Effects, like a really dark book. So I would say like it's not for the faint of heart, but like very educational. Um, he's the author who also did the famous experiments, the Stanford Prison Experiments. That's also part of
Ah.
the book. It's a very interesting read, but quite dark as well. So like if you already are predisposed to having a bit of like a cynical viewpoint of humanity, it might not be the best one to read.
What's that book called again?
The Lucifer Effect.
The Lucifer Effect. Yeah, because I'm pretty well aware of the Stanford prison experiment. I've read about him, obviously seen the movie as well, and it's definitely very interesting. But the Lucifer Effect, that one, we'll check that one out. So, what about fictional books? You say you read novels, for example.
Oof, yeah, that's quite a few I've gone through here. Let's see. I'm gonna think like quite a few I've read, but I read quite a bit on what's called like the a page that's called Royal Road, which is basically where authors can start, like putting out their work before they actually publish it on through like Amazon and things like that. So a lot of them are like currently ongoing still. I think one of the ones that I really enjoyed reading in the past, not on Royal Road, but it's like The Name of the Wind was like a super good book. Like had great mechanics for the magic system they had in there, like a good story to like explain how everything works, like explain the world. I think it was a great book. There's two or three books out right now, I believe. Still not finished last I checked, so I'm eagerly awaiting the next couple of books in that series. Otherwise, of course, I've read, like both the Harry Potter series and the Lord of the Rings. Like again, amazing books. Oh, I think
Okay,
that's sort of like the ones I would put the highest on my list. Like especially if an introduction to fantasy books.
okay. And what was that website or platform that you mentioned where they can put their authors put their books on before they're released and they might still be in progress?
Yeah, it's called Royal Road. It's like a quite a good platform. It's like by no means are the like the books perfect. Like I said, it's like works in progress for a lot of the part, but it's amazing to see like the quality a lot of times of the work that get put in there.
Okay, is that kind of like a Kickstarter kind of thing, or
Not really Kickstarter. I mean, they do have patrons and other things where you can support the authors. A lot of times they didn't offer you to read chapters ahead on their Patreon accounts and things like that. But yeah, a lot of times it's like authors are sharing in there to like get feedback. Like essentially get early reviews from like almost like user research in a way, right? They like can post things in there and then see how well it does. And then of course Patreon usually the ones who are very appreciated by the audience. They tend to also like do quite well on their Patreon account, so they can sort of get sponsored as they write before they then publish, and then hopefully their books do really well on the on Amazon, like Kindle Unlimited or the things that they usually tend to go with.
Okay, I mean, I'll definitely check that platform out. It's not a platform that I've heard of, but I'll have a look. So that's it, everyone, for this week's episode of FireDEV. I just want to thank you, Lenny, for taking the time to come onto the podcast today. It was really informative. It was really interesting to hear from somebody that's worked in these big studios and somebody that is like an art director as well. So thank you very much, Lenny.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's been super interesting to be on here as well and get these kind of questions that I don't really usually get on a day-to-day basis. And
Fantastic.
interesting to think about as well, a lot of these questions.
Yeah, sometimes it's interesting to reflect and actually kind of think about it from a non-career standpoint, because sometimes certain things like this you don't think about as much, some of the topics that we've covered, but
Hmm.
it's always nice to kind of think about it, especially when it's not in like a interview formal setting where there's not really any stakes.
Yeah, exactly. It's very educational to get like questions from a different perspective in a way, right? And then try to think about it in a new, like from a different perspective.
100%. So yeah, again, I want to thank you, Lenny, for coming on.
Mhm.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning into this week's episode. I will see you next week on FireDev. Bye bye.